Welcome back to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Washington, and joining us again is F. William Engdahl, author of the book Full Spectrum Dominance. Thanks for joining us again, William.
Thank you, Paul.
Now let's look ahead into the 2010 and into a little bit more into the future, into the decade. What excites you? What positive trends do you see?
I see a very positive trend as what's emerging in Eurasia. I see what China is doing. I've been to China many times in the last several years and talked with numerous people across China, economists, government officials, think tank people, foreign policy people. I think what they are doing is a very deep rethinking of their basic economic strategy that they had locked into 30 years ago when Deng launched the modernization of China with Western capitalist methods in a controlled way. And now, since the economic crisis hit China in October, November of 2008, the government has not only invested $500 billion on infrastructure projects, some of it wisely, some of it not, but it's also launched foreign policy initiatives on the economic front that are extremely fascinating. Infrastructure projects to Vietnam, to the nations of Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, and so forth on the borders of China, also Myanmar. They are engaged with Pakistan. This is a hidden element of the broadening of the U.S. war to Pakistan, and that is the fact that China, which has had more than 3 decades of very close relations with Pakistan, regardless of governments, the Chinese military industry has recently signed a multi-billion-dollar contract for military fighter jets sale to Pakistan based on reverse-engineered Russian designs that they got a hold of. And that's deepening the strategic ties between Pakistan and China.
And China's building a big port right on the main oil routes in Pakistan.
Yeah. Another point in terms of Chinese economic diplomacy is the recent pipeline agreement with Turkmenistan, which simply rips the natural gas supply source from the Washington's Nabucco pipeline, which they had hoped would end run the Gazprom and the Russian pipeline diplomacy toward Europe and Southern Europe. So really, it's a fascinating development on almost every front. The Russian engagement in Africa, the Chinese engagement in Africa, to the extent it's based on bilateral cooperation, multipolar cooperation. The nations of ALBA, Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela, etc. Cuba, at the inauguration of Obama, was giving signals, very heavy signals, that it was ready to hold out the olive branch of peace and come to a deal because the Cuban economy is having severe problems, etc. And 6 months ago, the Cuban leadership realized that Obama was nothing but Bush in sheep's clothing and reversed that 180 degrees and began deepening its ties with its old Cold War ally Russia, and also with China. So, there's so many fascinating counterpoles that are emerging, and I think that's a much healthier world. This idea of it's U.S. Pentagon over all über alles, or else we have a world of anarchy. I think that's pure rubbish. It's the ideology. It's the ideology that drives many dedicated soldiers of the United States Armed Forces, but it's rubbish in terms of reality. I don't think that's at all the nature of the world. So I think we're in a very dynamic. We're at the end of an epoch, and if you will, 2008, 2009 were the milestones of the end of the epoch. And that epoch is a continuum from the emergence of the British Empire, as I see it, and the extension of the British Empire called the United States American Century after World War II. That epoch is closing out on the stage of history, and a new epoch is dawning. The forms are very incoherent as yet. They're groping if it's going to be the BRIC nations, which is a Wall Street concoction, or if it's going to be the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Eurasia, one form or another. I think it's inevitable that these countries are going to find, to say nothing of the countries of the Middle East, as well as Africa, and that they're seeking out ways where they can address their own national development needs and not the needs of a insatiable Wall Street financial structure that's bleeding them dry. So I think 2010 is a very exciting time to be alive, and I'm looking forward to what we'll see this year.
And what do you think will happen in terms of the global economy, and how will this affect these processes you've just described?
Well, I think we have to differentiate in the global economy. There is no global economy as such. There's a dollar system and a dollar-centered uh, debt system that's going to go through hell in 2010. I think the U.S. economy is going to become dramatically worse in the course of this year. It is every month in the last 16 months in real economic terms, not the official White House economic releases. So the dollar-based system and the ones closest to it, for example, that of Ireland and especially Britain, are really going to go through severe straits over the next course of this year. I think the rest, well, the countries that I named earlier, the Shanghai Cooperation countries, China, the ASEAN China cooperation countries, and others are going to find these avenues. They've had enough time to assess where the time bombs are in terms of credit derivatives and other things from Wall Street. So I think they're pretty clear. I think Europe is schizophrenic. I've said this on your program before. The European elites are schizophrenic. On the one hand, they're terrified of facing the world without the military umbrella of NATO and Washington. On the other hand, they see that the U.S. is a sinking Titanic in a real sense. So what's that going to bring them in the long term? They don't have the defense infrastructure. The U.S. never allowed them to develop the independent pillar of NATO, the European pillar. So they're in kind of a quandary where to go and how to go. But I think that will sort itself out in the course of 2010.
But given to the extent to which global capital still supports the US dollar, all the central banks around the world, and not just central banks, even individual investors and big pools of capital, every time there's a crisis, they're still buying American T-bills and dollars. The global system still very much depends on U.S. capital, Wall Street as the manager of that system, even if they're thinking long term. But long term is not 2010, is it?
No, no, no. The dollar is not going to disappear in 2010. No, we're talking about a period of a number of years. But I think there are going to be shocks in the dollar system that will force the pace of change. Right now, it's a lot going on beneath the surface that we don't see. But like these discussions between China, Brazil, Russia, and to an extent India, although there's a lot of mistrust between China and India, so long as India is tied into the U.S. Defense arrangements.
India has completely hitched their wagon to the American wagon train.
Well, not completely, but in a significant extent. The Indian elites are also divided. This dollar system, you have to have something in place to be ready to take decisive steps to pull the plug on the dollar system. And I don't think the Chinese their mentality is not one of, rash plug pulling on $1.5 trillion of dollar holdings in U.S. Treasuries.
It makes no sense for them to do it.
If push comes to shove, they're going to have to take defensive measures, and I think they're much more aware of that than they let on in the real world discussions.
What do you make of what's going on in Latin America?
Well, I think most of it is obvious. I think the Pentagon is building up Colombia as a major strike force against not just Venezuela and Chavez, but really ultimately against Brazil, which is the emerging economic colossus in the Americas. I think that's a bankrupt strategy as well. The history of post-1945 U.S. South American relations are a history of training the Latin American military elites, having putschs and coups and who knows what, Pinochet in Chile, the coups in Brazil against Goulart in the 60s and so forth.
And now Honduras.
Yeah, and now Honduras. But at a certain point, this is wearing thin, and I think Latin America, the ALBA countries, Ecuador has embarked on some very interesting discussions. I think the ties between Argentina, Ecuador, the so-called Bolivar countries are a very interesting development. They're looking for ways of bilateral trade that would end run the dollar and lessen their dependency on the North. And I think that's all to the good. I think the world should have more diversity. It's dangerous when one policy center dominates all decisions everywhere for everything.
So mostly optimistic. That's pretty good.
Well, that's how I see it. We could end it all tomorrow, but let's hope not.
Thanks very much for joining us, William.
Thank you, Paul.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.